Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another installment of City Lights Live, the virtual extension of the City Lights Booksellers and Publishers events calendar, where we continue to celebrate the works of authors we know and love through readings, discussions, and forums. I'm your host, Peter Maravellis, and tonight we are delighted to be celebrating in conjunction with our friends at Duke University Press, the publication of a very significant new book chronicling the rise and fall of the underground music and art scene in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, between the late 80s and the early 2010s. The book is titled The Williamsburg Avant-Garde, Experimental Music and Sound on the Brooklyn Waterfront. Drawing on interviews, archival collections, musical recordings, and much, much more. The book explores the scene's social, its cultural, and economic dynamics, really placing Williamsburg at the epicenter of New York's experimental culture. So we're pleased to have with us tonight the book's author, Cisco Bradley, discussing in depth this wonderful new work. Cisco is the Associate Professor of History at the Pratt Institute and author of Universal Tonality, The Life and Music of William Parker, also published by Duke University Press. He's going to be joined tonight by none other than Lee Ranaldo. He is a Grammy-nominated musician, composer, visual artist, writer, and producer. Many of you, of course, know of him as the founding member of Sonic Youth, and most recently, of his own solo projects, as well as collaborations with groups like Glacial Trio and Text of Light. So really a pleasure to have them both with us tonight. Before we begin, as is customary at the outset of each event, I would like to acknowledge that we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area. I'd like to take this moment to offer respect to those who have come before us as stewards of the land. So please join us now in offering a warm welcome to Cisco Bradley and Lee Ranaldo. Gentlemen, welcome to City Lights.
Thank you.
Good to be here. Cisco, it's nice to meet you. We haven't met in person, but I wanted to ask you where you are located at the moment. Are you in New York somewhere?
I'm normally in New York. I happen to be in Washington, D.C. at the moment.
Oh, okay. Okay. And I'm in Lower Manhattan in New York. This is the book we're going to be talking about. I've had the pleasure of sitting with it for the last week or two. The Williamsburg Avant-Garde, Experimental Music and Sound on the Brooklyn Waterfront. And I just want to commend you on the depth of the research of this thing. I mean, it's really just incredible how much it's incredible and apparent how much work went into this, searching out all these diverse happenings that were going on in this period. As Peter mentioned, the period the book covers, what would you call the period the book covers? Mid-80s to mid-aughts or something like that?
It covers basically 1988 to 2014.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. All right, a little bit later than I thought. You know, I have some questions to ask you, and I'm sure it'll prompt some discussion between us, and there'll be time at the end for questions from the crowd. But we thought that we would start with you talking giving your brief introduction and maybe reading some passages from the book to get a feel for the language and the flow.
Yeah. So thank you. Yeah. So, I thought I'd just talk briefly about the book itself, and then I will read a couple sections. So this book took about 10 years to write. And I think, thankfully, I didn't know what I was getting into when I started it. I think, probably think I was crazy to do it again. I began in about 2013, I began to, to interview musicians that had been involved in the music scene in Brooklyn, and with the intention of writing a book, a comprehensive book about the whole scene, kind of from its origins to the present. And then I realized, I think, after a year or two of working on it, that would be an impossible book to write, or impossibly long, as the case might be. So I kind of shifted into really focusing on what had happened in Williamsburg, since that was one of the real starting points for a lot of what came later. So, I began, sort of comprehensively interviewing people, and I did do, I think it was 182 interviews over the course of about 8 or 9 years. And talked with so many different people, and the book covers a wide range. When it says avant-garde, it really means everything from, I tried to capture really a spectrum of musics rather than try to, just focus in on one. And so there's certainly punk and post-punk in the book. There's quite a bit of noise. There's free jazz. There's some electronic stuff. There's experimental DJ types of performances that I talk about a bit. I touch a little bit on indie rock. I don't go all the way into indie rock, but certainly stuff that I felt like was kind of on the, on the kind of experimental edge of things. And then, I go into, especially in the later period, at the great Death by Audio venue, that was one of my favorites. I look at this sort of spectrum of stuff from post-punk to kind of avant metal to noise to, everything in between, with a lot of improv, with improvisation being a real kind of glue to a lot of what is covered in the book. So a lot of cross genre things. So it ended up covering a lot of range. And so I felt like I learned a lot as I was going through it, because it was certainly musics that I knew better than others as I was approaching it. But then, the backdrop in the book really is thinking about how the city was changing. Why did people go to Williamsburg in the first place? Why was that a conducive place for people to, to make music for a while? And then why did it at some point become no longer conducive to people really, in terms of a really major community forming and being able to thrive? In essence, I look at, kind of post-industrial New York in the 70s and 80s as the background, that provided wide open warehouses for people to, to take root in. And then, I look at the process of gentrification, which led to the mass displacement, not only of artists, of course, but lots of other people that lived in neighboring parts of Williamsburg. So, that ends up being kind of the rise and fall type of story, thinking about, how, and there's a couple of anecdotes I always share with people. People talk about right up until about 1999, people said, if you were walking down along the waterfront, you had to be cautious, because especially along Kent Avenue, between Kent Avenue and the river, you might be attacked by packs of roving wild dogs. I mean, people talk about that, and it comes up sort of regularly. It came up so many times in interviews. Sort of things like that, where you just think, wow, it was a different New York. Williamsburg was the sort of waste processing center of the city. The whole city sent its garbage to Williamsburg to be, processed. So, it wasn't for a long time, it hadn't been a very, in some ways, a very pleasant place, especially parts of North Williamsburg. And I should say, I'm really talking about the coastal parts of Williamsburg. And then things kind of rapidly changed. If someone could get, say 15,000 square feet and rent that for, under $1,000 in the 80s or 90s, now, a one bedroom might cost close to 5 or 6, depending on its location. So I try to talk about that, think about how the economic and just the rapid, the rapidity of the change, in terms of, going from being this neighborhood of abandoned warehouses to luxury condos in about, 20 years. So anyway, I would love to jump in. Is there anything else you would like me to do before reading?
No, I think it would be fine to hear some passages from the book. Do you live in Williamsburg?
I've actually never lived in Williamsburg. I lived near it. For many years, I lived in Bushwick.
Okay.
So, I moved to Bushwick. Yeah.
I gather you were a real denizen of many of the places in the book that you write about.
Yeah.
And from reading the book, I understood that at a certain point you were hosting, one of the things that was happening in Williamsburg were like parties in backyards or house concerts. And I understand that you hosted a series of those kind of concerts yourself.
Yeah, I did run my own series, a kind of a loft type of series in Bushwick. from 2014 to 2018.
Mhm.
So I mean, that's something I thoroughly enjoyed. I thought it was fantastic. I had a room, we could fit about 40 people, jam-packed, probably breaking fire code. So we were, we had, I put on, I think, about 35 shows over the course of 3 years, something like that. Usually did it about once a month. And I think I learned a lot through that process. Like much of what occurred in Williamsburg, I just talk about kind of art space, the difficulty to access art space, the difficulty to maintain it. And, it's been kind of the ongoing saga of New York, venues closing, getting priced out. But doing running my own series, I got to get some of the experience, I guess, of what that's like. Of course, even gatherings like the ones I had, I think were technically not legal, and I think that's something else, another thing I kind of think through the whole process, just because art space is so hard to come by nowadays, and our artists are constantly kind of being pushed into these marginalized spaces where they're expected to, where they're kind of forced to work, I think. So anyway, that's another part of it.
And that idea, the whole idea of loft concerts goes back to the 40s and 50s and jazz concerts, and it's been kind of a staple of New York, as well as other places. But really, it's been one of those New York things where people are putting on concerts, selling beer under the table or whatever it is, and yeah, illegal, but necessary for the artists to have some place to go.
Right. Well, and to this day, my favorite setting in which to consume art, like if I'm going to go out to a show, I'd much rather go to a loft show than a big concert hall. There's something about the intimacy, the connection. You can talk with the artist afterwards. The sound is coming right at you from maybe 10 feet away or 20 feet away. So there's something about it, and just the community feel that I think is really magical and wonderful.
Yeah, I agree. Well, let's have you read for a bit from the book to give people a flavor for the language and the subject matter, and then we'll talk further.
Cool. So I thought I would read a couple of very different sections. I kind of bookend my own book with these two sections. I wanted to read a section from the early period. The book's cut up into 6 chapters. The first chapter looks at what I guess mainly call the warehouse movement. Where artists are moving to Williamsburg and either renting or sometimes just occupying or squatting in warehouses along the waterfront. And so, I interviewed. There was a lot. Probably the strongest component in the early days in a lot of ways was, I would say, sort of a post-punk movement. Though there were many elements in terms of the music. So, but I want to read one of those sections just to give people the flavor of it. While warehouse parties raged in squats along the waterfront, painter, punk rocker, and filmmaker Michael X. Rose started a new series in 1991 that eventually came to be known as Radioactive Bodega. The series took its name from Radiac, the nearby processing facility that worked with radioactive waste, but that was eventually closed down owing to consistent activism, especially within the Puerto Rican community. The events took the music fests out of the abandoned warehouses and literally into the streets. One participant stated, they generally took place outside of a warehouse between North 7th and North 10th Streets at Kent Avenue that had once been an old munitions factory, which has since been torn down. The loading docks were about 4 feet off the ground and very wide, so they functioned as ideal stages for musical events. Michael Rose had often wandered down along the waterfront by himself to escape the oppressive summer heat, and it occurred to him then that it would be a nice place to hold concerts. He later wrote, it was a place of post-apocalyptic loneliness and desolation, right smack dab in the throbbing chaos of New York City. It was anyone's who was punk enough for the using. In another way, it began as a response to the warehouse movement, which Rose perceived as focused on art school and trust fund kids. Although he had studied painting at an art school himself, he did not identify with that, with what he viewed as an elitist arts culture that often emanated from such institutions. His events featured punk rock more than any other venue up to that time. The series began under the provisional name of October Revolution, and he used images from communist propaganda posters intended as tongue-in-cheek humor. After it drew disconcerted reaction from the predominantly Polish population of nearby Greenpoint, however, he changed the name to Radioactive Bodega. An ethnically diverse squatter community dwelled inside the warehouse and outside along the waterfront north of Kent Avenue. It's almost like a shanty town that was there. Occupied areas that now constitute several public parks. They lived in a collection of tents or other temporary structures made from plywood and with tarp or zinc roofs. Cooked over fires and traded junk or fished out of the river. Some people hollowed out cave-like enclosures within mounds of trash and debris to create other living spaces. Spontaneous music often happened within the community on old guitars and other instruments. And so Michael Rose Winnan kind of connected with his community, and actually they showed him how to bootleg electricity from the street so that he could wire up the musicians on the stage. The first October Revolution event held on October 12th, 1991 featured a number of local punk bands. In the flyer for the event, Rose wrote, "Not street theater, the street is theater. Parades, bank robberies, fires, and sonic explosions focus street attention. A crowd is an audience for an event. Release of crowd spirit can accomplish social facts. Riots are a reaction to police theater. Thrown bottles and overturned cars are responses to a dull, heavy-fisted, mechanical, and deathly show. People fill the street to express special public meaning and hold human communion, to ask what's happening." So he had this whole process of bringing in bands and he had a series of basically festivals. I think the largest one drew several thousand people, if you can imagine, to a completely informal music venue. Effectively, there are these loading docks sticking out of the back side of this warehouse where he just had the bands, stage themselves, and there's a big kind of open area, kind of adjacent to the sort of shanty town that had developed there, and so this whole community kind of merged and performed there. So that gives a little bit of a flavor of kind of the most, in a way, the most informal concerts that happened in the early days of Williamsburg. I wanted to take us to the last one because there's a lot of actually continuity in a way. In some ways, I sometimes say this history of music in Brooklyn, begins with the opening of a venue called the Lizard's Tail, and it ends with the closing of the venue Death by Audio. So let me talk about Death by Audio for a minute.
Can you describe the venue a little bit? Or maybe
Sure.
that's in the text.
Yeah, I think it's a bit in the text, actually. Death by Audio, located at 49 South 2nd Street, was the last great DIY venue in Williamsburg. It opened in the spring of 2007 and became the core of an underground scene that was a fertile site for experimentation as improvised music collided with rock, punk, metal, and noise. The club came directly out of the punk aesthetic, with every inch of the interior painted, graffitied, or covered in band stickers. At one end, there was a makeshift stage in a room that could hold 75 people, with an adjoining room in the back for overflow that also had a speakeasy bar. Before the venue ran its own bar, people would often bring beer and keep it in a collective cooler. It was sold off the books for cheap. Once the bar was put in, it was just a table in front of a refrigerator, usually stocked with one type of beer and perhaps two types of liquor. So, it had much of the aesthetic, I think, of some of the sort of the New York punk venues from earlier decades in a lot of ways. For a lot of us, multi-instrumentalist Weasel Walter explained, Death by Audio was a place where they understood what we were doing, and they welcomed us, whether we had a good night or not. We could do whatever we wanted, book whoever we wanted, and the sound was okay. They paid us if people showed up. That's what it takes for a scene to happen. So I think about that a lot. I mean, just what is it that makes music really take off, and how do venues function? Death by Audio was one of the most important venues for the development of the music that Walter had termed brutal prog back in 2000 to delineate bands that were more focused on dissonance and intensity than other forms of progressive rock. Incorporating elements of progressive rock, punk, post-punk, no wave, free jazz, math rock, heavy metal, grindcore, and Japanese noise, brutal prog was loud, aggressive, and challenging to audiences. So, this section I really go through and talk about a series of bands that that really were central to that scene. Throughout the book, I really do go kind of venue by venue. I wanted to get a sense of how was Death by Audio different from Zebulon, and how was that from different from another venue, and try to capture the culture that kind of surrounded each of these venues. What was the music culture at each of these places, and then talk as much as I can about individual bands and what happened in the live setting. I really did try to focus on what the bands were like live, as opposed to what they were like on their records, to try to capture these bands in these spaces and to really think through that. So maybe should we shift over to, do you want to shift into conversation, or?
Sure. If you don't want to read anything further,
I'm happy to read more, but I'd love to leave space for for us to take on questions as well.
One of the things that strikes me about the book is that like you said, maybe you were tempted to talk about a broader perspective on the Williamsburg scene. All of the Meet Me in the Bathroom bands that went on to kind of rock success. Yeah, Strokes, Liars, all of that crowd of bands are completely separate. I mean, you touch on them a little bit, but your focus is really on these underground, for lack of a better word, clubs for the most part, and underground music. I mean, most of the artists you're covering are really pretty obscure. There's not any big luminous names. It's all the people toiling and making this happen, and making, like you said, you don't have a scene unless people show up, and people show up if they're interested in what you're doing. And different of these venues over the years in Williamsburg brought that out. In the 90s in Manhattan, we had a club called the Cooler, which you didn't mention, and then Tonic, which you talked about. Was when the Cooler was subsiding, Tonic was kind of coming up, and those were the places where experimental music could happen in Manhattan, two of the places. And by the late 80s, early 90s, these places, people were getting priced out of Manhattan. A lot of the musicians were moving to Brooklyn, and that's the root, I guess, of this whole scene you're talking about. What did you know a lot of these people personally, or were you writing more objectively about the different groups that came and go? I have to say, I mean, I'm familiar with a bunch of these venues. There's a bunch that I was not familiar with, and this was a period when Sonic Youth was traveling a lot, and we were not in such regular touch with what was going on over across the river, even, And so a lot of the names that I read about in the book are kind of new to me, so it's really interesting to me to see all these different people covered.
Yeah, well, I think from the beginning I really wanted to cover. To me, I didn't care actually whether the musicians were well known or not. In terms of who I was including, I really wanted to go after the music that I really thought was trying to break new ground. So I think a lot of experimental music is not necessarily, I would say most of it's not commercially successful, or what, if you want to put it in those terms. But I think I really was looking for bands that were trying to break into something new, regardless of genre and regardless of whether their records were successful or not. And also try to the extent possible, sort of detect, how one experiment might lead to another experiment. Did I know people? I was beginning to get to know some of these musicians via their music, probably around 2005, when I was at that, I had moved to New York in 2000. I left, went to grad school, and then I came back in 2011. So there were some years that I missed, and then I was here from kind of after that, solidly. So, I've been listening to a lot of the musicians during that period where I was gone. But there were certainly a lot of people that I met and got to know through the writing of the book. So I would say, given that it took me 10 years from doing my first interview to the book appearing in print, I definitely got to know a lot of people through that time, especially when I was putting on my own series. I felt like that was also a way, that I got to know a lot of people and connected with a lot of the artists. Yeah, I mean, I think there are several. I mean, I don't know. It's hard to, what am I trying to say? I think that, do we judge a music by, how many awards people win or how much, you know what I mean? Yeah, exactly. So, but, I mean, there are a couple of MacArthur Award winners that are mentioned, that are certainly featured in the book. And then there are people who I think, very few people know. And I wanted to shed light on that as much as I could, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I thought, really it was the process of experimentation that I think had me most fascinated. So, yeah, I mean, I certainly cover music that I personally maybe don't enjoy listening to, but I appreciated it for what it was trying to do. So I tried to go certainly beyond my own tastes. And I didn't want the book to be me saying these bands are good and these bands are bad. I don't do that really at all. I really wanted to talk, kind of get artists to talk and get as many artist voices into the book as I could, kind of to create as much dialogue as I could between artists, over the span of 25 years. So anyway.
Yeah. So I'm curious from your perspective, if we're talking about like late 80s to mid 20 teens, like what do you see as the thrust of the development over there in terms of like the things, like what was happening over there and what were the sort of like either hallmarks of it or, triumphs of it, I guess you would say?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I have 400 pages. 400 pages that might speak to that in a way. I think it evolved over time. Now I would say in the late 80s, really with the uprooting of the punk community or out parts of the punk community in the East Village, following the Tompkins Square riots in 1988, there was this push, that kind of where some people just got pushed out, they got evicted or whatever, and people moved to Williamsburg around that time, and there was a big kind of movement there. I think that in a way that kind of undergirded a lot of what came later. I've always kind of thought there was this sort of punk kind of rock edge, kind of noise element that kind of is the through line for a lot of, I guess, what we'd either call the Williamsburg or the North Brooklyn sound, where regardless of what exact genre maybe is being played, I mean, you might hear free jazz saxophone that's just as sort of searing and aggressive as an electric guitar or something, So I think, that kind of hard-edged sound, I feel like has sort of pulled through. In terms of triumphs, I mean, I think there were a lot, and I hope as people go through the book, they'll, kind of jump off onto maybe artists that they haven't heard about before. I mean, the warehouse movement and all that in the late 80s and early 90s, I think I would say if I had been there at that time, I'd probably be a different person now. And it just because there were a lot of movements there then to, I think, really engage more than one human sense at a time.
Yeah. And there was a very social movement as well as musical, the environmental thing about like these lofts, these warehouses, but it really brought, I mean, that community was coalescing in this period, and these places helped that happen really as places for people to go when they were over there before it was, what it is today with 1 million venues and things like that.
Right. I mean, I think that, the late 90s, I feel like the scene kind of gained momentum. I think it got a kind of a critical mass around 98. It's amazing how many musicians I interviewed who said they got there in 1998, and it just kind of kept coming up. I think the word was out by that point that something was happening there, and that people, and also, you have really, it's like, where do the 23-year-olds move? Where can they live?
Yep.
They couldn't afford to live in the East Village anymore. So they were moving to Williamsburg or to other parts of Brooklyn. And so that, I think, the late 90s, the pirate radio station Free 103.9, I thought was just one of the most interesting parts of the book, to me anyway.
Yeah.
In terms of just people trying to seize the airwaves, this kind of pushback against kind of corporate takeovers, which really kind of swept through in the late 90s, and use the airwaves themselves as a potential medium for sonic art. I thought that was really interesting. And because they broadcast a lot of live shows via their micro pirate radio station, it became a flashpoint for the community. So, I mean, they could show up to a person's gig and actually with the mobile transmitter and broadcast right from there. So, stuff like that I thought was really interesting. And I think the loft movements, I mean, I think lofts, the reason why they're so popular is artists have control in theory, right? Artists have control of those spaces. So I think that any loft movement to me is a triumph of a certain kind, because you really ultimately want artists to have some measure of self-determination in terms of controlling their process, controlling how they're presenting it. So I think there was that special moment up into the early 2000s where artists really could do that in a place like Williamsburg. I think non-commercial art, it needs a space where people aren't having to pay many thousands of dollars in rent. So I think there was a time there where that was possible. And it's kind of interesting. I think as time went on, I think we kind of get closer to what we might regard as kind of more standard types of venues. You have like a bar or a restaurant that hosted music, and you kind of, you have that. And some of those were very important. I mean, Zebulon, in terms of a venue, I think probably was, I mean, in many ways the most important, or certainly the most impactful, just because it lasted for 8 or 9 years and had music 7 nights a week. There was just no equal in terms of the energy and the scheduling and everything. And they had a wide range of stuff. In the beginning, in particular, 2004, 5, 6, through that period, Zebulon really was committed to doing, I would say, forward-looking art. I don't mean they weren't later, but I think they sort of expanded to include a lot more different things later. Early on, and it was especially open to to putting on artists like Charles Gale and Carl Prush, Maurice McIntyre, and Butch Morris, who was originally from LA, and giving them the stage to do what they wanted. And then I think later on, of course, I mean, they were having, I think, a greater range of different kinds of things. I mean, Zebulon was a real triumph. I think we must say that for sure, very clearly. And so many of the artists that I talked to said they felt like their work, the work that they did at Zebulon propelled them on to other things later on. We can look at artists like, whether it's, people like Mary Halverson, or whether it's, someone like Martina Roberts, incredible alto saxophone player. She did a lot of her early shows at, both of them did a lot of the early shows at Zebulon. So yeah, I mean, I think having a venue that really believes in artists and pushes for artists, allows artistic kind of freedom on the stage, I think is always a triumph. And of course, eventually Zebulon closed in 2012, moved to LA. So LA won out on that exchange.
Yeah, and it remains a pretty interesting venue out there. So, what do you said the rise and fall? So how do you see, William, the scene there since 2014? Is this a victim of economic development? Is that the whole story pretty much, or?
I mean, there is some of that. But I would also say artists' resilience is always impressive to me. I would actually say, I mean, the real turning point was 2005, when there were a few years up to that point where the city was considering rezoning the neighborhood. And most of the neighborhood was zoned industrial, which meant that developers couldn't move in and build basically new development, condos along the waterfront and all of that.
Yeah.
But Michael Bloomberg did, as the story goes, I mean, this is just what I've heard, the story that's sort of retold is that Bloomberg was driving down the FDR, which is, the highway along the coast there on Manhattan, looked across and saw Williamsburg and sort of was like, well, wouldn't it be great if we could actually do something with that there? And then if you actually look at the language of the rezoning, it refers to it basically as unproductive landscape in the city that needs to be transformed into creating tax base, like increasing the tax base. It's literally that stark. If you remember, the great champion of that opposed Robert Moses and decades earlier, Jane Jacobs actually wrote a very powerful letter in which she supported a community plan, which had come up with a much more nuanced way of maybe rezoning certain parts and keeping other parts, controlled by artists and controlled by local owners and so forth. I mean, the transformation in 2005, within a year or two, the vast majority of artists that live in Williamsburg got evicted. It was that bad. So in some cases, you had buildings that might have, right around McCarran Park, there were buildings that had, dozens and dozens of artists within a particular building, especially a bigger building. And there were cases in which, you had dozens of people, dozens of artists being evicted at a time. The developers from that point on pretty much had all the power. So that's also, not only were they redeveloping, but prices skyrocketed as well. So when I think of Seth Masturka, who started he's a saxophone player. He studied with Anthony Braxton at Wesleyan, and he came, I think, around 2000 or just before. And he found his loft, which was what, I think 2,500 square feet for $1,200 in 2000. And that's a decent space that you could do quite a lot of stuff with. And he actually ran a loft for 11 years. It's amazing it lasted that long. But eventually spaces like that, I'm sure now either don't exist. And I actually meant to say, as you were talking before about me kind of being a denizen in some of these places and really getting into the venues. In the later years where I was writing, kind of finishing up the project, there were certainly venues that I knew about or venues that I had been to, but there were quite a lot of venues that I had never been to personally. And so I started going around systematically, just walking up and down these streets. And not only are none of the venues there, not one of them survives that I can think of. In most cases, the buildings aren't even there. The developers have taken them down, replaced them with new buildings. So, it's really intense. And I think
it's the classic story.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, maybe we should
place
be surprised.
interesting, and then the developers move in and kick the artists out and reap the financial rewards from it. Yeah.
Right.
I don't want to not have time for some questions, but I have another question I want to ask you. There's a sort of an index in the back where you've got recordings to listen to. You didn't make a playlist, which I wonder if you had thought about.
I would love to do that.
This is a massive list of albums and things like that. I think more so than single tracks. And after the music recordings, there's two categories. There's paintings and television. And in the paintings category, you list Cubist. I think they're Cubist paintings, one by Braque and 15 by Picasso. And I want to know what that's all about for one thing. And then in the television category, it's Star Trek Voyager and Gene Roddenberry's Andromeda. So I'm just really curious, when I got to the end of the book and I saw that, I don't remember reading too much about those subjects in the book, but what's with the Picasso paintings?
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, both of those probably have I think both of those are fairly easy to explain. The paintings, I listed because there's a number of Cubist, mostly Picasso paintings that I took a look at because of there's an instrument kind of inventor. His name's Ken Butler, plays a lot of different kinds of guitars. He makes, he's made instruments out of tennis rackets and guns and golf clubs and all sorts of different types of things, transforming them into musical instruments.
Yeah, he's a legend.
And he talked a lot about how this era of paintings were actually quite influential on his sort of vision for a lot of the instruments that he creates. So that's the explanation behind the paintings. And I just had to go and look at them and think about them. And then I was also sort of trying to look at the instruments that he had created.
Yeah.
Brilliant figure. And I think it also goes to show, that when I think about experimentation, it can actually take on a lot of forms. Experimental types of performance, experimental sounds, experimental medium, experimental media. So and I think the television, if I remember right, I think those are the drummer Mark Edwards I remember mentioning to me, and I think I mentioned this in the section where I wrote about him. Brilliant drummer, by the way, Mark Edwards. He played with Cecil Taylor in the 1970s. David S. Ware later on, and he's led many of his own groups for the past, I guess, about 30 years. Anyway, he talked about how he was very influenced by science fiction as a kid. So, I went back and looked at some of the, looked at Star Trek and so forth to try to get a sense of where he was coming from. So a lot of people were kind of dealing, I think, with cross genre and cross disciplinary types of influences in this scene. Which I guess makes sense when it comes to experiment.
And certainly those Cubist paintings were radical and not understood in their day. You were talking about Ken Butler, and I want to mention that I really appreciated that there were lots of images through the book, lots of photographs of all the different spaces, different people in different configurations, great pictures of Ken's instruments. I thought it was really great to have so many visual reference points in the book.
Yeah, Duke was generous. They gave me, I think, 50 photos for the book. They allowed me to have 50 photos. So I tried to make the best of it.
Yeah. Do we want to open it up to some questions?
Yeah, let's do that. That'd be nice.
Okay, and are they in the chat? Maybe Peter.
Yeah, we've got some stuff coming through. Diane asks, is there any kind of gathering or celebration of the music and artists of the scene?
I would say, it's not one single one, but there definitely are communities within, because there's so many different communities that kind of overlapped. And I think I'm right to say that there are probably many artists in this book that didn't know about some of the other artists in the book. It's just so much that was happening through the years in Brooklyn. And the way I think that people kind of come into the scene and leave the scene. A person might be there for 5 or 10 years, and then they move upstate, or they go to New Jersey, or they move to Philadelphia, or they go to New Haven, or they go some completely other part of the country or something. So I don't think there's any single one, but I do know of artists who've organized 20th anniversaries of particular events, and there have been certainly some key moments within the scene that should be marked. There was one last year. When Lee asked me about triumphs, I think one of the most interesting events in the book, if I can backtrack to that, is a thing that was called the Brooklyn Free Music Festival in 2002, May of 2002, where to kind of lift spirits in this kind of post 9/11 environment. There were a couple of artists that one of them, I think, worked had this big workspace in a warehouse, something like 20,000 square feet to work with. So he cleared it out and spent a month or two basically building in bars and stuff, and had music events on 2 floors, something like 50 or 60 bands played, with many of the events occurring on the rooftop. It just shows you what was possible in those days. Nowadays you'd get a noise complaint in about 2 minutes, or 2 seconds. But yeah, the changing urban landscape, is something that I think, has just evolved so much. So anyway, yeah, I think there should be more to mark, the anniversaries and kind of, ways of memorializing maybe this past, because the physical landscape has been removed. It's not there anymore. The map that I had, the three maps that I have in the book, towards the beginning, they're kind of haunting if you go around and try to look for these places. So there should be more that's done. I mean, the fact that many of the archives that I accessed were in musicians' basements or attics or, wherever, in a box that they had in storage. I tried to do what I could to kind of, bring light to a lot of this, but I think there's a lot of archival material right there that's, it's going to be lost unless somebody does something to preserve it.
Yeah, should be collected for sure.
Yeah.
Got another one, Peter?
Yeah. So Mark says this is a must-buy book. Yes, right on. Buy it, folks. We posted the links. As a Brit without much knowledge of this scene, what is one track that I must listen to after this meeting?
Ooh.
I always try to dodge these because I feel like I can't boil it down.
Of your 10 children, which is your favorite?
That's how I feel when I'm asked that question. I mean, I could name a number of artists. I think that interestingly, I would say a lot of the bands in the first chapter didn't necessarily record a lot of their work. It's pre-digital for the most part in those days. So, I would say much of, I guess, what we call discography, from the earlier era, I would say it was, it's kind of crazy to think about it. A lot of that stuff has just been lost, or they're on really hard to find. I suddenly found myself collecting like 7-inch, like Williamsburg punk records and things. Some of which I could find, and some I had to hunt for. But wow, a single track. I don't know if I can do a single track, but I can rattle off a few things. I would say, from the late 90s, early 2000s, there were so many bands that were converging on Williamsburg, and so just within that era, you have such a wide variety of things happening. In sort of minimalist noise types of settings. The PSI is a band that I always thought was really interesting. No Neck Blues Band from that era, I thought was just, such a visionary band. And I actually did a book event I guess it's a month and a half ago, actually, with David Nuss, who's one of the leading figures in that group. And then you have this sort of wave of I guess you'd say sort of creative musicians or free jazz musicians around the turn of the millennium. I think that did a lot of interesting things. Anthony Braxton's students were hugely impactful. You have like Mary Halverson, Taylor Hobynum, that kind of wave of people that were coming down from Middletown. And there's just too many people to name from that era.
Yeah.
And you have also another convergence. I think Nate Woolley, the trumpet player coming from the West Coast, he's done some really incredible work. The drummer Mike Pride was really, really active around that time. I want to give a shout out to the saxophone player who I know who's attending, Ross Moshe Burnett, who was born in New York and grew up in, he was very active with his Music Now units. There's just so much stuff. You have bands like, going forward from that, you have a wave of people that came in from Manhattan that started to play in Brooklyn a lot, especially at Zebulon. Figures like Charles Gale, who's an incredible tenor saxophone player. I think, maybe the most, maybe I'll say this, yeah. I think he's the most interesting saxophone player since John Coltrane. You have figures like Butch Morris, who put down, kind of put his trumpet down to develop a whole conduction technique where he would actually be conducting his bands live and giving different signals to different people, and really, kind of using his position as conductor to create a kind of orchestra sound. Jessica Pavone, I think, is actually a really, really interesting figure. I think viola player, played a lot with Mary Halverson, but has led her own bands. I think her solo records, which she started doing, I think about 10, 15 years ago, she started putting out a series of solo records. I also love her bands, but I think her solo records are absolutely genius. So, I mean, I think she's a figure that deserves more attention. I mentioned Martina Roberts earlier. She now has a long series of records under the name Coin. I think it's a 12-part series. I think she just released the 5th record. I think she's an absolute visionary. I often say, I can't believe that she hasn't gotten MacArthur yet. What else? I mean, I think Weasel Walter was really, is a really interesting figure. He was deep into the death by audio scene. He's someone who I thought, just kind of had a transformative presence. A lot of other musicians talked about him as inspirational and kind of a leading figure within the kind of hard edge, post no wave type of, improvised music. The band Little Women, I thought was really interesting, very kind of hard edge and confrontational type of, 2 saxophone quartet. I could go on and on and on. So I don't think I can one track, but I hope that gives you some idea, gives you some maybe way, places to start.
Yeah.
So we have a question from another Mark. And actually, this could be directed at both of you. What were some of the new musical methods that were developed during the experimentation of this period?
Lee, do you want to start, or
No, I think that since we're focusing on Williamsburg, I'd be curious to hear your answer to this question. I mean, in a way, it's an interesting question.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, there's quite a lot that I could say.
Because this community in Williamsburg was obviously coming out of a lot of stuff that had happened previously in Manhattan and elsewhere. I mean, I know you talk a bit about the Japanese noise scene in the early 90s and how that influenced a lot of people in a lot of places, and that was one of these elements in Williamsburg that was happening. But yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
No.
That's great, Lee. Thank you. And please interrupt at any time.
If I could add just say a couple of things, I'm glad you brought up Death by Audio. And I think because there was a kind of an unbridled creativity, like aesthetically, and I think also technically, what a lot of people might not know is that they also kind of split off and were a pedal maker. And they would create these insane pedals like the Apocalypse. And just these like things like Total Annihilation, I think, was another one. I mean, and they're really tongue in cheek, but the design itself was gorgeous. And a lot of these things are like artifacts, but they were also pushing the sonic envelope to places where, later, like within 5 years, you've got like 100 other makers out there kind of doing this crazy stuff. And I don't know, Lee, you might have a few things to say about that.
Well, I know some of those pedals, but what it made me think of was how one of my impressions about what that Williamsburg scene was about was, it was really youth oriented, and they were across the river from all the heavy stuff in Manhattan, the gallery world or the highfalutin world of big clubs. And it was like they didn't have to, my impression of Williamsburg in that period was that like they didn't really have to give a shit about anything, and they could be as weird or funky. There was a kind of a funky community element to it, and people were just felt free to do stuff in a way where they knew that like they were not under a heavy duty spotlight, so it was a little bit easier to be experimental without without the whole world watching, basically, in a sense.
I think you're absolutely right. A lot of people even said that in a way, because it was a little bit off the beaten track, it kind of gave people a measure of freedom to kind of do what they wanted. Without the pressure of having to like, okay, if you don't bring 50 people to the club, you're not going to get a gig here again. Instead it was, often more open. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, just to talk about methods or techniques, I think one thing that I really began to think about when I wrote this book that I hadn't thought about, I think, in as much detail before, was how the digital revolution has allowed people to do so many things. But before that, people had to, a lot of sounds that we now take for granted back in, the pre-digital era had to be created physically. It was interesting. I mean, I think of, like, say, the DJ collective La La Landia, which I thought was a really interesting group. They had a performance space that they called El Sensorium, and they considered themselves omnisensorialists, which meant they were trying to engage with all of your senses at one time. I mean, I joke about that. I think if I'd gone there, I don't even know what I would be doing now. I'm sure it'd be something, whatever. Something else would be doing, doing my life. I think that, I think that, they talked about creating an entire experience. So, I mean, is that a different kind of method? It's a very sort of, just trying to saturate people with, kind of surrounding them with things. So, you had people, maybe spontaneously creating performances from within the audience or something. And then you might have, one of the things the DJs is they create an array of record players that they put on the wall. And he wanted certain sections to repeat. So he'd basically create a loop. And he would do that by sort of physically kind of tying down the arms so it could only go a certain distance, and then it would, whatever, kind of go through this loop. But then he put maybe, I think he said 12 of those, or like a dozen of those on the wall next to each other, and they'd all be playing different things. So he'd create this kind of almost like, I don't know, like musique concrète or like, like a collage in a way of these different sounds. So, I think of, like, there was a lot of that. A lot of the noise bands. Now a lot of noise is turning knobs, which is great. It can be brilliant. But a lot of noise in the, in the 80s, there was, in the 90s, there were people that were, like, creating noise by using non-traditional instruments, incorporating a fan or different pieces of metal, getting kind of experimental with what types of percussion they were using, the sort of exploration of various types of metallic sounds. So I mean, I think of, like, the digital revolution made some of that no longer necessary. Or you could say, I don't know, maybe something was lost in that transmission in that transition, in that it's I think the way that we receive that is a little bit different now. I mean, I would say those are probably the biggest things, or those types of innovations towards the use of technology that really just had a deep impact. But I mean, there are tons of different, I would say, evolution of techniques on various instruments, the way that people are thinking about those instruments. Probably too much to say, but I mean, a lot of that's in the book, and musicians certainly talk about it.
Yeah. Cisco, may I ask a question? I'm really curious to know, like, how you pieced this together, and what that whole process was like, and because I imagine, like, you did a whole bunch of interviews, but then I'm sure there's, like, other materials that you're accessing too, and cross-referencing, and 10 years is a long time.
It is a long time. Well, I mean, I did my first interviews in 2013. And I think I thought, well, I'll just talk to enough people until it starts to make sense. That's honestly was my initial method. And after about 2 or 3 years of that, I realized I needed something else to kind of pull together. The other thing I did in that time is that I created I guess we call it a sessionography or a gigography. I went through every publication I could find, whether it was, newspapers, the New York Times, the New York City Jazz Record, a number of punk zines. I just tried to, like, any music publication that I could find, and just started to record lists of gigs. And I just recorded them by I just made this massive Word file. It's literally an 857-page Word file that covers mainly between 1998 and 2014. The earlier years were much more difficult to kind of to document. I think before 98, it was truly underground, whereas by the turn of the millennium, I think it was sort of partially above ground. But I wanted to be able to see what the big picture was, and it was an overwhelming big picture. I mean, 857 pages of literally just each line, or every other line or something would be a different concert that happened. I arranged them by venue, and then within venue by date. But it allowed me to begin to kind of see like who really was focusing on Williamsburg, who played, what bands really played in the venue. When I looked at Zebulon, for example, I didn't look at the most famous people who have ever played at Zebulon. I looked at the bands that really kind of made that their home, and that was their home base. And maybe they played anywhere from 3, 4, 5 to maybe 20 gigs in a year, depending on their frequency and stuff, or maybe 10 gigs over the span of 3 years, depending on the band, something like that. Because I really wanted to think about how did these spaces impact the musicians? How did these musicians impact these spaces? That's really the dynamic. So the method, I think that's when I kind of put that gigography together, that allowed me then to begin to see how to break it off into pieces that I could then really write about. Up until that point, it was overwhelming, and I remember thinking, how am I going to do this? I have all these disconnected interviews. How am I going to find a narrative? And then, honestly, the gentrification narrative just emerged very organically out of the interviews and the material. Once I started to map out where the venues were, you look at 2005, you look at 2006, you look at 2007, and it's like within those 2 years, it's just like, okay, everything and sort of along the coast, the river was gone. So spatializing it was, I think, maybe the third component. I had never really done extensive oral history work before this, but now I enjoyed it so much that I want it to be a part of probably everything I do going forward. I always want there to be an oral history component. I'm a historian. I was trained, to work in archives. It can often be very disconnected. You're reading something about the past. There's maybe very few human voices in there a lot of the time. So I really wanted to bring in those human voices. And so that was, I think those were the components. And then, I tried to draw it together. And in the middle of writing this book, I also took a break and I wrote the book on William Parker. And I think that was actually a necessary break. When I came, I basically from 2016 to 2019, I took off 3 years from this book, and I worked with William on that book. And when I came back to it, then I was really able to, I think, somehow see, I was just too close to the material for those earlier years to really be able to disseminate what was important, what was significant. So I think, I sometimes say, and I actually truly believe this, that I really don't feel like I can effectively edit my own work until I've forgotten what I said to a certain degree. Like, okay, I haven't looked at that chapter in 6 months. I might have a general idea of what I said, but I don't remember the specifics. And then you go back and you just feel less tied to it. You're like, oh wait, this paragraph doesn't need to be here, or these details are unimportant, or whatever. And then you can kind of read it down.
Yeah.
Well, we find ourselves at the top of the hour. Lee, was there anything further that you were curious about or want to bring up? Or
no, I just, for anyone who hasn't seen the book, I wanted to talk. Cisco mentioned these maps at the front, and there's a series of 3 maps that outline I forget what the dates are, but there's an early one where there's just this little smattering of clubs. And then there's a middle one before the zoning restructuring where there's just a ton of clubs on the map. And then after the zoning, you see them dwindling away again. And it's just in 3 quick little visual things, on a couple pages, you get kind of the story that's being told right there.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, ever grateful to you both for this illuminating discussion and just the references alone are worth the price of admission. I mean, City Lights has always valued the avant-garde in all of its forms, and I really feel like this book is an important addition, just about how scenes emerge, also just an excellent resource and help us better understand their life cycles and really how we can encourage and kind of generate, I guess you could say, all tomorrow's parties, so to speak. So thank you, Cisco, for bringing this into being. Thank you, Lee, for doing the honors tonight. Very grateful to you for that. And to all of you in the audience, I see Maureen Russell of the San Francisco Rock and Roll Book Club, all kinds of friends in the audience, and a few folks from the East Coast. Hey, thank you for coming. Also want to remind everyone, we have posted links with which you may purchase copies of the book. Better yet, if you are in the Bay Area and you're in the hood, come on down, browse our stacks. We're located in San Francisco's historic North Beach district. We are open 7 days a week now, 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. We're getting back to our pre-pandemic hours. And today's event has been made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, continuing the legacy of the late Lawrence Ferlinghetti through public events like this one, our publishing program, and educational outreach, all dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and independent thinkers. So thank you, everyone. So long. We hope you'll take care of yourselves and see you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.